My wife cheated, got pregnant by her boss, and told me to sign as the father. That's how my story begins, not with a quiet warning, not with months of suspicion, but with a newborn in her arms and a pen waiting for my signature. 6 years of marriage, and I thought the foundation beneath me was steel. But in that hospital room, with both of our mothers standing close, and the air still thick with the smell of disinfectant, the ground shifted. My name is David Carter. I was 41 years old the day my daughter was born, or at least, the day I thought she was my daughter. I'd spent 2 decades working oilfield projects across the Gulf, gone for weeks at a time, then home again for stretches too short to make up for the distance. I provided well. I gave Rachel, my wife, the house she wanted, the life she dreamed of, and when she told me she was pregnant, I believed it was the final piece, the one that would lock us into place as a family. We painted the nursery yellow. I put the crib together myself. We argued over names late at night like young lovers again, laughing, building a dream we both claimed to want. I slowed down my offshore work, moved into more office assignments, so I could be there. I thought I was building permanence. I didn't know the cracks were already spreading by the time we checked into St. Mary's Hospital. I thought I'd done everything right. The delivery was rough on Rachel. But when they finally placed that little girl in her arms, her face softened with a light I had never seen before. Both of our mothers hovered near, whispering advice, fussing over blankets. I stood at the end of the bed, feeling like the happiest man alive. Then the nurse walked in with a clipboard. She explained the process, fill out the highlighted sections, hand it back. They'd file the certificate. Routine. Automatic. The kind of thing no one thinks twice about. Rachel smiled at me, her hair damp from labor, her body weak, but her eyes insistent. Honey, why don't you fill this out? I'm tied up here. She cradled the child in her arms like it was the most natural request in the world, but something inside me froze. Maybe it was the way she avoided my eyes. Maybe it was the way her hands trembled when she held out the form. Or maybe it was just that tiny shadow of doubt that had been buried deep in me for months, finally clawing its way out. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I just spoke, calm and sharp enough to slice through the air. No. We'll wait. After the DNA test, the room went still. The hum of the air conditioner, the baby's soft breaths, and the shuffle of paper in the nurse's hands. Suddenly it all seemed loud. Because no one else was speaking, my mother's eyes widened. Rachel's mother stared at me in disbelief, and Rachel herself looked like the floor had given out beneath her. She tried to laugh it off. She tried to act confused, but her smile didn't reach her eyes, and her fingers kept tugging at the baby's blanket like she needed something to hold on to. My mother-in-law snapped at me, called me cruel, accused me of humiliating Rachel in her most vulnerable moment. But I stood my ground, because when a man has carried even the smallest seed of suspicion, and the timing of life doesn't add up, that seed grows into something you can't ignore. So I repeated myself, steady and sure, the truth comes first. Before I sign anything, in that moment, I wasn't just refusing ink on a page. I was refusing to chain myself to 18 years of lies. The birth of a child is supposed to be the moment a family becomes whole. For me, it was the moment my marriage broke wide open. And though I didn't know what the test would prove, I knew one thing for certain: there was no going back. Before that hospital room, before the clipboard and the silence, there had been years that looked perfect from the outside. David Carter was the kind of man who built his life brick by brick. He had worked the oil fields for 2 decades, sometimes gone for weeks, sometimes a month, always returning with enough money to keep the lights bright in the Houston house he and Rachel had chosen together. It was a steady rhythm, long absences, short visits, long absences again. Not every woman could live with that, but Rachel seemed to thrive on it. She had her friends, her hobbies, her little routines, and David believed that as long as he provided, as long as he returned with his arms open and his loyalty intact, everything else would hold. When Rachel told him she was pregnant, David felt like his life had just shifted into a better gear. He started moving out of fieldwork into more office-based projects, cutting back his travel. For the first time in years, he could make dinner most nights. They argued about names late into the evening. They stood shoulder to shoulder, painting the spare bedroom soft yellow, stenciling rabbits and foxes across the walls. Those months felt golden, solid, like proof that the years of sacrifice were worth it. For once, David thought the timing was perfect. For once, he thought the ground beneath him was unshakable, but the cracks were already spreading. At first, they were small. Rachel started wearing a new perfume, sweet, heavy, a scent he didn't recognize. When he asked about it, she said a friend had given it to her as a gift. She smiled, but her smile seemed rehearsed. Then there were the late nights. She claimed she had more responsibilities at work, more projects that needed her attention. He wanted to believe her, so he did. But when he called her office one evening, just to hear her voice, no one answered. And the receptionist later told him Rachel had left hours earlier. The whispers came next. Nothing direct. Just little fragments overheard when he picked her up after work. A coworker who hesitated before saying goodnight. A pause in conversation when David walked into the lobby. He told himself he was imagining it. A man gone as often as he was could easily get paranoid. But the pieces began to line up in ways he couldn't ignore. During one dinner with her family, Rachel slipped, mentioning how he had been helpful carrying boxes for her. When David asked who, she stumbled, corrected herself. I meant she, one of the new girls from work, but her voice was too quick, too defensive. It was the kind of mistake you make when your mind is carrying two truths and your tongue can't keep them straight. By the time they arrived at St. Mary's Hospital for the birth, David's faith was already cracked. He didn't show it. He carried her bag, held her hand, whispered encouragement during the long hours of labor. But inside, he was waiting for the proof that would either quiet his doubts or confirm his worst fears. And then, when the nurse handed him the pen, when Rachel's eyes flicked away from his with just a little too much fear, he knew. He didn't need to scream. He didn't need to accuse wildly. He already had the name, Greg Walters, Rachel's boss, the man she had described as a mentor, someone who pushed her to grow, someone she admired, the same man David had seen linger too long in conversation with her at a company barbecue. The same man whose name had surfaced more and more in her stories, until David noticed she stopped mentioning him altogether. Standing in that hospital room, David let the words come out with a calm that chilled everyone present. Greg Walters, your boss. Rachel's head snapped toward him. For a second, real fear flashed in her eyes before the performance began. Denials tumbled out. Outrage, confusion, disbelief. Her mother gasped, demanding to know what he was talking about. David's own mother stood frozen, her lips pressed into a thin line. Rachel laughed weakly, as if the accusation was absurd. Absolutely not. I've never. She cut herself off too quickly, catching the slip before it landed. But that half-second pause was enough. David leaned closer, his voice low, controlled. Don't deny it. I already know. The air grew heavy. Rachel's hands trembled around the newborn, her smile forced and failing. Her mother shook her head, repeating that this was madness, that David had lost his mind. But he didn't back down, because deep down, he had already put the puzzle together. The perfume, the late nights, the whispers, the slips of language. It all pointed to one man, Greg Walters, and now, here they were, in a room where new life was supposed to begin. And instead, David was calling out betrayal with the steady voice of a man who had nothing left to lose. The nurse shifted uncomfortably by the door. The air conditioner hummed. The baby whimpered. And the silence between Rachel's denials was louder than anything else. David didn't flinch. He didn't soften. He stood firm in the knowledge that the DNA test would decide what Rachel's words never could. 72 hours from that moment, he would know whether he was a father or just another man left carrying someone else's burden. And either way, nothing would ever be the same again. The hospital room turned into a courtroom without a judge. Rachel's mother was the first to erupt, her voice sharp, her words a whip. David, how dare you? How could you accuse her of something so vile at a moment like this? She stood tall at the foot of the bed, shielding her daughter with her outrage, like a mother bear ready to tear into anyone who threatened her cub. But David's own mother didn't flinch. She crossed her arms, her jaw tight, her eyes locked on Rachel. She had lived long enough to know when silence spoke louder than words. And in Rachel's eyes, she saw something. Not confusion, not innocence, fear. Rachel's denials came fast, tumbling out in rehearsed tones. Greg, absolutely not. I would never, he's my boss. Nothing more. Her voice rose with each sentence. But her hands betrayed her. They kept tugging at the baby's blanket, adjusting it again and again, as if the fabric could shield her from the truth. David said nothing for a long moment. He just let the silence stretch. Let the weight of her performance collapse under its own cracks. Then he spoke, calm and steady. Each word like the strike of a hammer. You ended it when you found out you were pregnant. Didn't you? Rachel's head jerked up, her mouth opening. But no denial came fast enough. Her mother's eyes darted between them, confusion twisting into dread. Who told you that? Rachel demanded. But the edge in her voice gave her away. I didn't need anyone to tell me. David replied, your slips told me enough. And the rest I already confirmed. The room went still. Rachel's face drained of color. Her mother stumbled back, whispering, Rachel, please tell me this isn't true. But Rachel only shook her head, stammering excuses. He's lying. He's twisting everything. You know I love you. You know this family means everything to me. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He simply held her with his gaze. And when he spoke again, his words cut sharper than any shout could have. Love doesn't look like perfume I've never smelled before. Love doesn't look like late nights you can't explain. Love doesn't look like your boss's name slipping out of your mouth when you think I'm not listening. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. She tried to force a laugh, but it cracked in her throat. This is crazy. You don't have proof. David's voice stayed calm. I don't need proof from you. The DNA test will give me all the proof I need. That was the turning point. His declaration settled into the air like a verdict. 3 days, 72 hours, and the truth would no longer belong to her words, her denials, her desperate explanations. It would belong to science. Rachel's mother turned pale, lowering herself into a chair, her face hollow with realization. David's mother stayed stone still, her silence a judgment harsher than words. Rachel clutched the baby tighter, rocking her gently, whispering nonsense into the child's ear as if pretending the world around her hadn't shattered. But her trembling shoulders told the truth. David took a step back from the bed, his voice low but final. Until then, I sign nothing. If she's mine, I'll raise her. But if she's not, Greg Walters can carry the weight of his own choices. The baby whimpered softly. But the adults in that room said nothing more, because in that moment, they all understood the clock had started. In 72 hours, the mask would fall. The truth would be written in black and white. And the life they thought they were living would never return. And David Carter, standing steady in the storm, knew he would not bend. When the delivery room fell quiet and the DNA test was set in motion, David thought the storm was his alone. He believed it was just his marriage, just his life unraveling. But betrayal has a way of spreading its poison wider than you expect. It started with a phone call. Tom Harris. His wife Karen had worked at the same office as Rachel. Tom's voice was low, measured. The voice of a man trying to hold back the fury in his chest. He didn't waste time with sympathy. He simply said, "We need to talk." They met at a dim corner booth in a sports bar. Two men who had once been acquaintances through their wives, now sitting across from each other as allies. Tom didn't flinch when David laid it out. Greg Walters. The late nights. The whispers. The hospital showdown. When David finished, Tom leaned forward and said, "Karen told me the same name. She didn't get pulled in. But she heard the bragging. Walters thinks he's untouchable." That was when David realized he wasn't alone. Within days, 2 more men joined the circle. Mike Reynolds, a police officer whose wife Sarah had suddenly grown secretive. Don Coleman, a business owner whose wife Jessica had begun working suspicious late hours. Each of them carried their own quiet suspicions, their own puzzle pieces. And when those pieces were laid out together, the picture became clear. Greg Walters wasn't just Rachel's mistake. He was a predator moving through their community. One wife at a time. The air in that back room was thick with anger. But not the wild kind. This was controlled, calculated. The anger of men who had been humiliated, lied to, and left with scars they couldn't hide. No one suggested going to HR. No one mentioned court. They all knew men like Walters didn't fear paperwork. What he feared was exposure. the loss of his charm, the collapse of the image he used to lure women into his orbit. The agreement was unspoken, but it settled between them as clear as any contract. They would talk, they would share, they would make sure every husband, every family, every corner of the community learned exactly who Greg Walters was and what he had done. And when the whispers spread, his power would shrink. David sat back in his chair, the bitter taste of betrayal still heavy. But for the first time since the hospital, he felt something else: solidarity. He wasn't just a husband fighting alone, he was one of many. And together, they were about to make sure Greg Walters learned what it felt like when the walls closed in. The plan didn't need to be written down. It lived in their eyes, in their silence, in the firm nods exchanged around that table. This wasn't revenge. It was something colder: consequences. 3 days later, the envelope was in David's hands. White. Sealed. Ordinary in appearance but heavy enough to decide the rest of his life. He sat in his truck outside Rachel's mother's house, staring at it. For 72 hours, the question had haunted him in every waking thought. Was he a father? Or was he just the man asked to play one? When he finally stepped inside, the air was already thick with tension. Rachel was on the couch, her mother by her side. The baby lay across her chest, tiny breaths rising and falling against a blanket. They looked up as he entered, and in their eyes, he saw fear. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He tore the envelope open, his fingers steady, his face unreadable. His eyes went straight to the line that mattered most: probability of paternity, 0. Evangeline. The words were cold, clinical, without emotion, but they carried the finality of a judge's gavel. David let the paper fall to his side. His voice was flat, almost detached. She's not mine. Rachel's face crumpled. Her mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, as if she could hold the truth in by force. Rachel began to sob, her body trembling as she clutched the baby closer. She whispered, "I'm sorry," again and again. But the words were weightless now. They couldn't mend what had been broken. David didn't move toward her. He didn't shout, didn't curse. He simply stood there. A man who had carried suspicion, endured humiliation, and now held certainty. And certainty required no argument. "I've already spoken to my lawyer," he said quietly. "The divorce papers will be delivered this week. You can stay here for now. You'll have help." Rachel's sobs grew louder, her mother trying to console her. But David felt nothing. No urge to comfort. No temptation to turn back. That bond had been severed long before the ink dried on the test. His mother had been right sometimes. Silence says more than words. And his silence now was louder than all of Rachel's tears. By the end of the week, Springfield was humming with whispers. People didn't say it openly, but David could feel it in the way conversations halted when he walked into a room. Everyone knew, not just about Rachel's betrayal, but about Greg Walters, the man at the center of it all. The whispers turned into patterns. Other men began looking closer at their own homes, their own wives. A few ordered DNA tests of their own. The results painted a picture no one could ignore. Greg Walters wasn't just a boss. He was a predator, a man who preyed on loneliness, who wore his charm like a weapon, who collected women as trophies. And now, his reputation, the thing he valued most, was slipping from his hands. David didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat, but he watched quietly as the consequences spread. Husbands compared stories. Families connected the dots. And Greg, once untouchable, found himself exposed under the weight of his own arrogance. For David, the verdict had been written in black and white. But the real victory wasn't just the DNA test. It was knowing he had walked away without losing himself. Rachel had lost a husband. Greg had lost his shield of secrecy. And David Carter had lost his marriage. But he had gained something greater: the clarity that comes when the truth finally cuts through every lie. And from that clarity, he could finally take his first step forward. In the weeks after the DNA results, David carried more than paperwork and memories. He carried a weight small enough to hide, heavy enough to remind him of everything he had lost. It was a hammer he'd once kept in the garage. Solid steel with a worn wooden handle. He told himself it was just a tool, but he knew better. It had become a token, a symbol of control in a world that had spun out from under him. Every time he saw it, every time he felt its weight in his hand, He imagined the power it represented, the power to strike back, to reclaim dignity by force instead of silence. He never used it. He never planned to. But he couldn't let it go. Not yet. Months passed. The divorce finalized. The house sold. Rachel faded into the distance. Her voice carried now only through lawyers. Greg Walters kept his head down as rumors swirled. His charm cracked beyond repair. Still, David kept the hammer until one autumn night, standing on the deck of an offshore rig, staring out at the endless black water. The Gulf air was sharp with salt and diesel. The waves restless beneath him. He pulled the hammer from his bag and held it one last time. Cold. Heavy. A reminder of the anger that had kept him alive, but also kept him chained. Without ceremony, he let it go. It arced once against the night sky and vanished into the sea. The sound was small. The release was not. When the hammer sank, the anger went with it. For the first time in years, David Carter felt lighter, not because the past had disappeared, but because it no longer owned him. Years passed. The man who once stood in a delivery room demanding truth was no longer carrying the same weight. David Carter had rebuilt, not in grand gestures, but in steady steps. He met Anna on an ordinary afternoon. Nothing dramatic, just a conversation that stretched into laughter, then into dinners, then into a life. Anna was different. She wasn't dazzled by status or stories. She carried her own scars, her own quiet resilience. And she offered him something Rachel never had: honesty without performance. Together, they built a home that wasn't large or flashy, but warm. Their daughter, Sophie, filled the rooms with laughter instead of lies. Saturday mornings were pancake stacks and sticky fingers. Evenings were quiet talks on the porch while Sophie played in the yard. It wasn't perfect. No life is. But it was real, and real was enough. Looking back, David understood something most men don't realize. In the heat of betrayal, walking away doesn't mean weakness. It means refusing to let someone else's lies define your future. Betrayal doesn't just break a man, it remakes him. David Carter walked away not with rage, but with dignity. He lost a wife, but he gained something no lie could ever steal: peace. Gentlemen, if you were David, what would you have done? Would you have chosen revenge or quiet strength? Share your thoughts below. And subscribe for more true stories of betrayal and justice. Because in the end, it isn't the betrayal that defines you. It's how you rise after the truth finally comes out.